welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking at what happens when a tenant decides, hey, I think I'll just stay a little longer. And, a simple contract clause turns into a big legal fight.
Yeah, and it all starts with a case all the way in the Philippine Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
GR no, 116665. And this case is about 3 commercial units that were leased out. The tenant was named Azcuna, and the landlord was Barcelona.
All right, so we have a tenant that's overstaying their welcome.
Right.
That's got to cause problems, right? So what makes this case so interesting?
So the lease agreement that they signed had a clause that said if the tenant didn't move out, they'd have to pay P1,000 per day, per unit, as damages.
Per day?
Yes.
Wow, and so that wasn't even like for rent. It was like a whole separate penalty.
Exactly, and that's where this idea of liquidated damages comes in.
Okay.
So it's basically like a set amount that both sides agree to ahead of time.
Okay.
To cover any potential losses if one of them breaks the contract.
So it's almost like they're anticipating something could go wrong.
Ah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of like a prenuptial agreement,
Right.
but for business.
So they don't have to argue later about how much it's going to cost if somebody breaks the contract.
Yeah.
They just agree on a number up front.
Exactly.
But I could see how that could lead to some pretty big penalties.
Yeah, and that's actually what Azcuna argued when Barcelona took him to court.
So walk me through this. What happened? How did it end up in court?
Well, Barcelona filed an ejectment case
To get him out?
to get Azcuna out of the units,
Right.
and the lower courts actually sided with Barcelona.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they ordered Azcuna to vacate and pay all the back rent and that P3,000 daily penalty,
Okay.
plus legal fees.
Of course.
As you can imagine, Azcuna appealed that decision.
So he took it all the way to the Supreme Court just because of this penalty?
Yes, he argued that the penalty was way too much.
Yeah.
And he cited some other cases where the damages were limited to just like the fair rental value.
Mm-hmm.
But the Supreme Court saw it differently.
So they sided with the landlord?
Yeah, they upheld the earlier rulings, and they recognized that the P3,000 a day wasn't just some random penalty.
Okay.
It was part of that liquidated damages clause in the contract.
Okay.
And they said it was different from fair rental value.
Right.
And they even pointed to this other case,
Oh, really?
goes on de Bermuda, where there was a similar clause, but it had a P5,000 per day penalty.
Yeah.
And that was upheld too.
So basically they're saying a deal's a deal.
Pretty much, yeah.
Even if like one of the sides later on feels like, oh man, I agreed to something way too high.
Yeah, and that really shows how the court upholds this idea of freedom of contract.
Uh-huh.
Basically, as long as what's in the contract isn't illegal or goes against public policy,
Right.
the court's going to stick with what both sides agree to.
That makes sense, but doesn't that bring up some questions about fairness?
Yeah.
Like, what if one person has more power than the other when they're making the contract?
That's a good point, and we'll definitely talk more about that later.
Mhm.
But the main thing here is this case really shows how important it is to read and understand every part of a contract before you sign it, especially anything that talks about penalties.
Absolutely. It can seem like a small detail when you're signing, but man, it can come back to bite ya later.
Definitely.
Yeah, ouch. So it's like those terms and conditions we just click agree to online.
Yeah, you got it.
We don't really think about what we're agreeing to most of the time.
Right. We rarely do.
But this case shows how important it can be.
Exactly. Even those small clauses can have big legal consequences.
Yeah, so in this case, both the tenant and the landlord, they both agreed to this liquidated damages thing. Does that mean like the court always goes with whatever's written down, even if it seems kind of unfair later on?
Well, not always.
Hmm.
The freedom to make a contract is important,
Right.
but it's not the only thing that matters. Courts can step in if a clause is really unreasonable
Okay.
or if it goes against what's good for the public.
So there are limits,
Exactly.
even if everyone said yes at the beginning.
Right. But this case really underscores why it's so important to really think about the terms of a contract before you sign.
Right.
It's not just about avoiding those penalties.
Uh-huh.
It's about making sure the agreement is fair to both sides.
Right. So you're not getting taken advantage of.
Exactly.
Okay, so that makes sense. But let's be real. Legal language can be so hard to understand.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What's the best way to make sure you really get what you're agreeing to?
You're right. Legal jargon can be a big obstacle.
Yeah.
Well, first off, don't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah.
If something's unclear, just ask for clarification.
Right.
It's also a good idea to have someone who knows about law look over the contract, especially if it's about a lot of money.
So it's worth it to get some legal help up front to avoid problems later.
It's like getting a home inspection before you buy a house.
Oh, I like that analogy.
You want to make sure everything is okay before you commit.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So let's flip it around. What if you're the one writing the contract? Like a landlord making a lease agreement. What's your advice?
Well, the most important thing is to be clear.
Okay.
Use simple language whenever you can, and avoid all that fancy legal jargon.
Right.
Make sure all the terms and conditions are spelled out clearly, especially the parts about penalties.
Okay.
And if there's a clause that's really complicated,
Yeah.
think about adding a simple explanation.
So you're basically saying make it easy for everyone to understand.
Exactly.
Okay.
Transparency and mutual understanding, those are really important for a good relationship.
Right. Whether it's a landlord and a tenant or business partners or even those online agreements.
That's right.
This case really shows that contracts are more than just pieces of paper.
Yeah,
They're about trust and clarity in all kinds of relationships.
absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And while we've been talking about this lease agreement,
Yeah.
what we've discussed applies to pretty much any contract situation.
So it's all about being careful and knowing what you're getting into. Okay, so we've talked about the legal side of things and some practical advice, but I'm curious about the human side of this. How do you think this case reflects the relationship between landlords and tenants?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
I think it highlights how important it is to have open communication
Right.
and to find a balance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, both landlords and tenants have rights and responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And a well-written lease agreement can help create a respectful and beneficial relationship for everyone.
So it's not just about enforcing rules?
No, it's about building a good dynamic between both sides.
That's a good point. So the lease agreement shouldn't be a weapon.
Right.
It should be more like a guide.
Exactly. A roadmap for a successful tenancy.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's amazing how a simple lease agreement can lead to such complex legal issues.
It reminds us that these legal principles have real-world consequences,
Yeah.
and that paying attention to detail can prevent misunderstandings and problems down the road.
Right. We started with a tenant overstaying his welcome, and now we're talking about the bigger picture of clarity and fairness and informed consent and all sorts of agreements.
Absolutely. It underscores that contracts are more than just words on paper.
Yeah.
They represent a promise,
Yeah.
a shared understanding, a way to navigate relationships in different parts of our lives.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
What about your own contracts?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah, from leases to those online terms of service, are there any small details that could have big consequences later on? We encourage you to take a closer look and see what you find.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.
All right, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
See you next time.
Bye.
So this case really makes you think twice about just skimming through contracts, doesn't it?
It really does.
It's like those terms and conditions online, we just click agree to.
Exactly. A perfect analogy.
Yeah, so in this case, both the tenant and the landlord agreed to this liquidated damages clause.
Right.
Does that mean the court always sides with whatever's written in the contract, even if it seems unfair later on?
Not necessarily. While freedom of contract is super important,
Yeah.
it's not absolute. Courts do have the power to step in
Okay.
if a clause is just way too out there.
Unreasonable.
Yeah, or if it goes against public policy.
So there are limits to what can be enforced,
Exactly.
even if both parties initially agreed.
Right. But this case shows how important it is to think carefully about what you're signing
Okay.
before you actually sign it.
Before you get yourself into that mess.
Yeah, it's not just about avoiding penalties.
Right.
It's about making sure the agreement is fair for both sides.
Right, so you're not getting tricked.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But legal language can be so confusing.
Oh, yeah, it can be a nightmare.
What's the best way to make sure you actually understand what you're signing?
You're right. Legal jargon can be a big obstacle.
Yeah.
So first of all, don't be shy about asking questions.
Okay.
If something doesn't make sense, ask for clarification. And it's also a good idea to get a legal professional to look it over,
Okay.
especially if there's a lot of money involved.
So it's worth investing in some legal help up front
Absolutely.
to avoid problems later.
Exactly. It's like getting a home inspection before you buy.
Right, right. I like that analogy.
You want to make sure everything's good to go before you commit.
Okay, so let's flip it around. What if you're the one writing the contract? Like a landlord creating a lease agreement.
Right.
What's your advice for making sure it's fair and clear?
Clarity is key.
Okay.
Use plain language whenever possible. Avoid all that legal jargon.
Yeah, make it easy to understand.
Exactly. Clearly define everything, especially anything about potential penalties.
Okay.
And if a clause is particularly complex,
Uh-huh.
maybe add a little explanation in simpler terms.
So it's about making the contract legally sound, but also easy to read.
Precisely. transparency and mutual understanding are crucial.
Right. Whether it's between a landlord and a tenant, business partners, even in those online agreements.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this case really emphasizes that contracts are more than just pieces of paper.
Definitely.
They're the foundation of trust and clarity in relationships.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, and while we've been focusing on this lease agreement case, the principles we've talked about apply to any contract situation.
Exactly. Contracts are everywhere.
Yeah, so no matter what kind of agreement you're dealing with,
Right.
it's all about being informed and knowing what you're getting into.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the legal stuff and some practical advice, but I'm curious about the human element.
Okay.
How do you think this case reflects the dynamic between landlords and tenants?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I think it highlights the need for open communication and balance.
Right.
Landlords and tenants both have rights and responsibilities. And a good lease agreement can be a framework for a respectful and mutually beneficial relationship.
So it's not just about the rules.
It's about building a positive dynamic.
Right. So a lease agreement shouldn't be a weapon. It should be a roadmap.
A roadmap to a successful tenancy.
This deep dive has been so insightful. It's fascinating how a seemingly simple lease agreement can bring up such complex legal questions.
It really is, and it reminds us that legal principles have real-world impact.
Absolutely.
And that being detail-oriented can prevent so many headaches down the line.
We started with a tenant who didn't want to leave, and now we're talking about the bigger picture of clarity, fairness, informed consent in all sorts of agreements.
Absolutely. It underscores that contracts are more than just documents.
Right.
They represent a commitment, a shared understanding, a way to navigate relationships in all areas of life.
And before we wrap up our exploration of this case, I want to shift our focus to a final thought-provoking question. We've talked about clear language and being aware of penalties.
Right.
But what happens when something comes up that's not actually written in the agreement? Like, how do courts handle those gray areas?
Yeah, that's where things get a little tricky.
Yeah.
That's where legal interpretation comes in.
Yep.
So when a contract isn't clear or it's kind of ambiguous,
Uh-huh.
the courts have to figure out what the parties really meant.
Okay.
They'll look at the language of the contract,
Right.
what was going on at the time,
Okay.
and any relevant legal precedents.
So it's not just about what's written down black and white.
Exactly. There's a lot of judgment involved.
Okay. So it sounds like communication is key right from the start.
Absolutely. The
Yep.
goal is to have an agreement that benefits both sides
Uh-huh.
and spells out everyone's rights and responsibilities clearly.
Right. So it's not about trying to trick the other person with fancy legal words.
No, not at all.
It's about making sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening.
Yeah, it has.
It's amazing how a simple lease agreement can lead to such complex legal questions.
It really is. It shows that these legal principles have real-world effects.
Yeah.
And that even those small details in contracts can make a big difference.
We started with a tenant who overstayed his welcome. And now we've talked about the bigger picture of clarity, fairness, and making sure everyone understands what they're agreeing to.
Yeah, it all ties together.
It really highlights that contracts are more than just pieces of paper.
Absolutely. They're about commitments,
Yeah.
shared understanding, a way to build relationships in different parts of our lives.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive,
Okay,
I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
I like it.
What about your own contracts?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, from leases to those online terms and conditions.
Right.
Are there any small details that could have big consequences later on?
Something to think about.
Yeah, take a closer look and see what you find.
Until next time, keep exploring.
Yeah.
Keep asking questions and keep diving deep.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.